My name is Carl Quill, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. I've known Guy Costantini since we worked together at Riot, which was also his first game studio job. Since then, he's gone on to work at other major notable publishers and developers before starting his own, Still Stealth, studio last year. He comes from a marketing background and shares how he's used that to propel him into the startup space, fundraising, and founding journey in general. I love listening to the journey of those who come from very different backgrounds than me and how they adapted those experiences to the journey we're all on. Let's get into the interview.
And those are all of our secrets.
Those are all of our secrets. Everything we're sharing. All right. So the thing I always like to kick off the conversation with is there was some moment, that you were like, I'm going to go start a company. Now's the time. Now's the moment. I've decided I'm actually going to commit to this path. Talk to me about how you got there, what led up to it, and what was the catalyst that made you go like, no, now is the time for me to start this company.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool question because you have to go back and think about it when the moment was. It's usually kind of more of an aggregate of things, that kind of the straw that breaks the proverbial camel's back. But I think that really, I've been thinking about starting a game company my whole life, right? I wanted to since the first day I started at Riot, which was my first gig in games. And then I just kind of always felt that I didn't know enough. And I know that there's like two ways people go about building companies. One is just, fuck it, let's go do it. And the other one is I want to have enough that I feel I'm not going to completely mess it up. And that I was in the latter category. And I think it also required a moment of being at my day job, so to speak, and being like, you know what? I think I could do this better. And I don't think I can convince enough people to change this thing I'm doing with them. I just want to start it from scratch. Right. And, all the places I've worked at have all taught me great lessons, and they've all been a part of getting ready for it. And once I knew, I was just like, oh, I should start this like immediately. And then like also need to plan my exit properly and all that. But like really, it was kind of this moment of, I feel like I'm now ready. Like it's kind of, I don't know, people that have kids usually equated to, you're never really ready, but you are prepared to take that leap, right? Which I think is important. And I think I credit my last career put me in a pretty comfortable spot when it came to having enough room to do this and be able to try at it. And when I already saw the market conditions kind of not being great, but I was like, I think that in every market condition, there is opportunity. And actually market conditions not being great feels to me like a great time to see if I can build something that isn't just able to be built at any point in time.
I think it's always to your point, sort of a building feeling, right? Like there's a moment that the wave crests and tips over and you start to go on the journey, but it is sort of this building feeling for a lot of folks. Do you remember, when you like first hard committed, was it just a moment of, okay, now I feel like I'm ready? Or was there, was it an event? Was it meeting a potential co-founder? Was it, oh my God, I have an idea and I really want to go and do it? Was there anything in particular? Or was it just like, no, now's the time?
Well, I had already started writing sort of the beginning of this kind of original IP that I thought needed to be developed. And I was trying to think, should I develop this at my current company? And because I was in a position where I could propose this as just a thing that I think we should do. And I was like, I just think that I could see all the different ways in which it could die. And I was like, I just don't see this as a thing that they would want to make in the place where we're at. And then I also had been talking with a good friend for about a decade about whether or not we wanted to work together on things. And we had worked together on some projects. And finally, he's like, yeah, I've been wanting to do this forever, but I didn't know how to go about like being engaged in starting a game studio. And I just kept telling him how like all the things I had learned, which he almost had the benefit and privilege of naivete, right? Where you're like, oh, it's just a company, right? Like people make companies for anything, right? Like you could go and make a company to sell cobalt to like governments like tomorrow, right? If you just don't think that that's hard, right? You're just going to go, I don't know, try to get mining rights out of some country and then eventually you'll discover the difficulty, right? And so I think that what he brought, he's my co-founder, and what he brought to the table is that he kind of told me, well, you are the person that I knows the most about this industry and this space, and you speak a lot about all the different ways that people have built organizations and what works and what doesn't. And so why don't you just kind of actually take the leap and instead of just talking about it? And I said, well, you're right. Let's at least start like an LLC, and let's put the pieces together of that, because that'll make it feel real. That there's like kind of this like partnership. And then eventually we changed it to a corporation just for fundraising reasons. But we kind of started there, like the conversation of like, well, what are the building blocks of actually doing this? And what's the kind of games we want to make, the kind of people we want to attract, the kind of journey we want to take before we even decide, all right, this is going to be our day job, right? Because that requires a bunch of funding. And actually to this day, my co-founder is not full-time on this. He's actually still, we have yet to have a need for his services full-time, which is, again, to me is a big commitment that he has towards the organization, that he's willing to wait for us to be ready, for us to need his role, to be actually paid. And so at the beginning, I think we both put in like some nominal amount of money. Like I think it was like 20 grand each or something, which again, it's not nothing, right? But it's like, you're not going to make any serious, I mean, I guess I shouldn't say that because there's plenty of people that have made games with like zero money. So, the kind of games I wanted to make, you couldn't do much with 20 grand each. But this was more of like a form of commitment that we, would both fund at least that much ourselves, and then like figure out what we would do with it. And that would kind of precipitate the cresting of that wave that we were talking about, right?
It definitely sounds like your co-founder was like, oh, well, you know everything there is to know about starting a company, and I don't want to learn all of that. So why don't you take the lead?
No, actually, so that's a great follow-up. So he actually had just come off of a startup, and he had a day job, but he had built a startup. He had gotten out of it. The startup had been acquired by had been slowly acquired by private equity group that slowly muscled the original founders out. It was like kind of he learned a ton about sort of like building a business. And it was actually a pretty successful business. They raised millions of dollars. They were doing a bunch of kind of agency content for esports companies, like large esports companies like, Valorant and Overwatch League, stuff like that. And they were kind of more of an agency. So he had built that from scratch. And so he had a lot of entrepreneurship experience, and he had gone from there to kind of take a little bit of a breather from entrepreneurship back into taking just a job. And he kind of still had the itch for kind of not having to just do a job. And that just happened to line itself pretty well with me kind of wanting to take that leap. And again, I had also built small sort of BS companies that I just wanted to do just to see if they would turn into anything, and they didn't, but they maybe allowed me to do some stuff that I otherwise couldn't have. I think in my 20s, I started a music production company because I wanted to go to music events and not pay for it. And so I kind of wanted to go out and party on the weekends and have some money left in my pocket at the end of it. So I did that for a little bit, and that taught me a whole lot about, trust and the people that you will trust with even moderate amounts of money. But it was just, it wasn't an exercise that was ever meant to be the thing I really cared about, versus this, which is literally the thing I care about the most in the world. And so to arrive at this point took me decades, I suppose.
Yeah. I remember making a company so that I could go to E3 way back in the day as a college kid. I'm like, yep, this is my totally legit game development studio. That
That's right.
and it is funny
I
how
feel
that,
like
like,
you went about it the harder way, because most people are like, I'm a journalist and I work
yeah.
for geocities.com/Carl.
What's funny about it is, like, I think, going all the way back to that is still like the first time that I thought about actually starting a company was after I had made this totally made up company for E3. I'm like, but what if this was real? Wouldn't that be cool? So you decide you're going to make the leap. You have a co-founder that you feel pretty good about. What do you feel like you really had to go and figure out from there, right? Like, it sounds like you've had some experience setting up companies before. Your co-founder had pretty big experience with entrepreneurship, but like, now that you've committed to this path, what is the big thing you go off and you're like, okay, I have to learn this, this, and this?
Well, so luckily I had a pretty good friend that had just gone through the journey of that as well. Like he'd done a purely like VC funded startup. Started with like friends and family money, which I'd been like very early on in. So I'd given him like, I don't know, 25 grand for his company. And then like he raised a few $1,000,000 on it. And then like grew it and did all kinds of stuff with it. And so he was giving me a lot of sort of the nuts and bolts stuff that I guess I was privileged in that I didn't have to go figure out, like, should I do an S Corp or a C Corp, right? Like, he had a bunch of recommendations there that were the equivalent of, like, reading venture deals, I suppose. And then, like, he also recommended I read venture deals, which I did. And so I kind of, like, tried to accelerate some of the kind of mechanical aspects of, like, building businesses and figuring out how to go fundraise and all that. But I think that the thing that I cared about the most is that we actually had something that was worth building a company around. Because I always knew, like, everybody in our industry always has a million different game ideas they're in love with. And I always felt like that we're never going to be at a shortage of that. I obviously want something that I believe in enough that I can rally folks around it, but it should stand on the company itself rather than just a specific game. And so I felt like we wanted to put some cycles towards figuring that out. So me and my co-founder kind of sat down and talked about like the kind of company we always wanted to work for, like what would be some of those aspects that we cared about, some of the ethos and all that, without like losing too many cycles on it. Just kind of, can we put something together enough that it feels like a good vision of what we believe in, and that we can explain it succinctly enough. Luckily, we're both marketers by trade, so the exercise of creating that was not super difficult. But it still was. It needed some time and thought put behind it. You know.
So one of the questions that I like to ask about that sort of moment that you figured out you wanted to found, you went through this process of getting it up and off the ground. What's the big like takeaway or thing that if someone came up to you tomorrow and was like, I'm thinking about starting a company, I think I'm ready to do it. What would you be like? Hey, here's this key nugget of wisdom that I would give you. That was the biggest, most important thing that I have from my journey.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that it's hard to distill to one, so I'll try to think about it. But I think that the thing I think I lucked out in some ways because I really like it took me like 15 years to figure out the kind of game company I wanted to make, right? And the kind of games I wanted to make and the kind of people I wanted to work with and all that. It took me like 15 years to figure that out, right? And so when I started this, it was all about doing so in a way that was the most just likely to make this thing happen the way I had come to envision it should. And everyone that I attracted around was in agreement that this is what we should be building. And so I wasn't sort of like having to figure that out with a bunch of people. And I think that really accelerated a lot of our company building and development practices just because I had a very clear view of what I thought I wanted to build. And I tested it by, let me see if I can actually convince people to join me on this road. Because like if they all tell me it's a terrible idea, then maybe it's a terrible idea. And so that I think understanding sort of like what's that end point you're driving towards, like what's that vision for this organization, I think is important to know. So you don't just start second guessing yourself I think it becomes like very complicated if you start like spinning your wheels on what is it that we're here to do as you are trying to get everything stood up, right? Um, and I don't know, like that. So that's the thing that I would think about a lot. And I think the other side of it is that I would warn any new founder on is just understand that engaging lawyers costs money, a lot of money, and everybody understands this inherently. But I don't think it's more of a thing that we all understand. But I think that you can find very startup friendly law firms that won't charge you anything or next to anything until you are sort of seed funded. And that's sort of how they get their payday. And I think that being careful with some of these expenditures that can really go off the rails is important early on, because you can end up with like a 30 grand legal bill and be like, I can't believe we spent 30 grand on lawyers in like 2 years. And like, I feel like I've just been using forms anyway. Right. So it's like, again, like in our case, we have a company and a subsidiary in the Netherlands, and like we have employees in the Netherlands. So it's like, there's a reason why our legal fees are a little higher than your average startup. But I think we were paying very close attention to our spend very early on, both out of necessity and out of my co-founder's experience with a less than responsible set of C-suites in the past. And because of that, like we caught some stuff early, but I could have seen easily going like overboard with those expenses in ways that I wouldn't recommend any founder have to deal with. So those are kind of like, one is much more practical, like just watch the dollars. Even if you're lucky enough that you get cut a big check, just watch the dollars. It's very easy to, we've both been at places that created money printers and like it immediately bought every cool thing ever, including people, equipment, real estate, technology. And that's just, it's just not great, right? Like you can't buy so much so quickly and make good decisions. That usually doesn't happen.
Yeah, 100%. And I think I've never met a game studio founder that didn't talk about having their eyes open to the costs of lawyers, because it's kind of wild how much lawyers can rack up especially when you're like trying to close fundraising deals and all that kind of stuff. One of the things I wanted to jump back to, because you dropped something interesting in one of the answers, is that both you and your co-founder have a background of being marketers. And I'm curious, like we talked a little bit, you mentioned a little bit about how you've known your co-founder for a while and where he came from, but what made you think, oh, this is the right mix of co-founders? Like we two are the right ones to shoulder this company and he's the right co-founder for me. What made up that mix? And obviously it's not all about discipline per se, but like, help shed some light on how you got to the team of co-founders you are.
Yeah. So actually that's a super good question, because the moment my first conversation with my co-founder was actually, we're not the right two people to do this. I was like, because I'd seen it so much. I'm like, and I inherently understood the advantage we would bring to the table, because I think most development teams actually are very weak on the marketing, or they're either weak on the marketing completely, or they think they're good, which is possibly worse, because it means that they are discounting the discipline of marketing. Which is super important. Distribution marketing is kind of like what can make or break a lot of studios. And so I just knew that the product itself, right? Like games themselves are what you will be selling. So you need to have a strong voice at the founder level that is either game design or game direction, like enough game discipline to be the person that makes decisions there. And so I knew that was missing, because I'd spent like 7 years publishing games, right? Like I was on like Greenlight at Skydance, right? So my first thing with him was I said, listen, we can create like the foundation for this company and the foundation for this IP that we think we want to build, but nothing. We should reduce spend to almost zero until we can find someone to make the game prototype. And we should really only be spending our money making game one prototype. And then, so we need to find someone like that. And so we undertook like a pretty long, sort of interviewing and recruitment journey to find game people that actually did want to go and partner up with some marketers, right? Which is, again, like, Venn diagram pretty thin. But, luckily I built enough good rapport with folks over the years that I had a few people to talk to. And then it's like, it's that founder matchmaking like cycle, right? Where, which I think you alluded to in some of our previous conversations. Like, you got to find folks that are kind of just right for what you're trying to accomplish and for you, and test the team chemistry out. And luckily we had the luxury of time on our end. So we just kind of took our time and we said, listen, the company is not really started. Sure, we have an LLC, and sure, we're going to put some cycles towards some creative development, but the company is not really going to start until we have a game director. And so we can even start prototyping with someone that has game design chops and knows Unreal, and some artists can put some art together. But I'm going to tell everybody, this is literally us just engaging in a creative exercise of collaboration until we have a game director. So let me go and find that, and it'll take forever. And by the way, they may come in and cut out 90% of what we've built so far, and you just have to be comfortable with it. And luckily, everybody on board was okay with that. And I guess I repeated it enough that they really started believing it. And then finally, when we actually did find the perfect game director, they kind of like fell in like a perfect puzzle piece, right? And then I found that doesn't usually happen, but because of all this prep work and because of how long it took us to find the right person, when we found them, they were just like, oh, yep, I'm changing these 5 things, and this is the game we're making, and we're off to the races. And like within, less than a year, we basically have something that is like a vertical slice of a game, right? Which is, I didn't think was possible. But I think a lot of that was because we didn't hire a game team and then said, hey guys, make something fun. Go and iterate for the next like 4 or 5 months, and let's figure out what we can make. Right? Instead, we kind of went about it in a little bit of a backwards way, which is like, well, we know this thing, that the world really wants this thing, the thing of this rough shape, and we just need to find the right people that believe that too, and let's build something to prove that this is the case, and then let's show it to enough folks and see if we can like raise capital behind it, and then let's actually like sort of like pedal to the metal. But it really ended up paying dividends, I think. So hopefully that answered the question. I talked a lot.
No, for sure. It's a fascinating story. So when you talk about the game director that you brought on, is that, so I often make the distinction between like the founders of the studio, which I often sort of delegate as like the folks who are on the cap table and before any dilutive investment are the sole owners of the studio. Those are the founders. And really a lot of being a founder is being willing to take the full scope of the business on your shoulders to some degree, right? Like the buck ends with you, right? And then there are first employees who often get called the founding team in some ways, but they're the people who are willing to show up when it is a very tiny business and willing to do a lot. But at the end of the day, they are still taking management and direction from the founders, right? Like they're there to do a job, not there to have their identity inherently intertwined with the studio from here on out. So when you went and found that game director, who sounds like you went on a really big hunt, you found someone who really meshed well with you, saw the world the same way you did, and in many, you even used sort of like the matchmaking idea of it. Is that game director another founder, and so you're a founding team of 3, or is that you went and found a game director, but it's a first employee game director?
You know what? I think that the best way to think of them is as a founder, and I told this to the, so we actually had I sort of like, but also sort of don't like the distinction that you make between founding employees and founders. I understand what you mean by sort of kind of majority cap table owner sort of thing, because like from the very early day, we wanted to make sure that everyone that helped early on was on the cap table in some form. But yes, there was definitely sort of 2 founders, and they had a majority of all the shares there. There was definitely a couple of folks that helped us in key positions early on that definitely got enough percentage points that they wouldn't feel bad as a founding team member being called founders. But one of the frank conversations I had with everybody that had any sort of ownership in the company was, when we do find this game director, they will have a substantial percentage ownership of the company, which will feel, I think won't feel great when you put a year and a half into a company just to start making it, even in a fractional capacity. It'll feel like, hey, this person just came on board and they're getting a really big chunk. And the reason for that is because, listen, this is a very needed resource that has to have that degree of authority and has to have that degree of kind of cap table ownership in order to have that authority, beyond the fact that we're just saying they have that authority, right? And so I think that was an important aspect of it that I wanted to make sure the team really understood. And that's exactly what happened when we found them. Like, actually, they asked for a smaller amount than we gave them because I wanted them to be really bought in, and also to understand that this wasn't like, I considered what we built before them to be sort of like the way to bring the people together more than like the company that we're actually building. And sometimes things take a little longer to get where you want them to be. But I've always found, especially in our industry, that if you take your time, as long as you're not setting mountains of money on fire while you take your time, usually you end up refining what you're doing. And then by the time you decide to kind of actually press on the accelerator, hopefully you're going to crash into less obstacles, to use a car analogy.
With them being, significantly, I'm trying to think of the right word, because it's not bought in per se, because it's like you give them the shares to, but they're a big part of that sort of founding team. And it sounds like their role in the studio is functionally a third co-founder in many ways, right? Like they weren't necessarily there on the, founding the LLC, but they're functionally a founder.
And now, like, effectively, if you think of leadership team at current state, there are two people that are full-time from the leadership team, and it's myself, and it is the game director. And everyone else that is getting compensated is sort of like effectively reporting into this leadership. Now, we have other folks that are effectively acting in leadership capacities, but they are not full-time. And everyone that is working full-time is sort of reporting into a leadership function, right? So it's for, even if like we're super flat because we're super small, so it's not like nobody's like reporting into anyone. We're just like, hey, listen, this is what we're making. Who wants to do it? And it's still in the very cool sub 10 area where like everybody's doing everything that they can to make things work. But simultaneously, like that's sort of how we organize it.
Yeah. How do you and your co-founder, so that both the co-founder, game director, who is sort of full-time right now, as well as your third co-founder, who is part of the fabric of the studio, but isn't working full-time or even part-time right now because you haven't needed a second marketer yet. How do you guys make decisions?
Oh yeah, so we have this thing that we call State of Chaos, and it's a weekly conversation where we all get together and talk about the things that we're trying to accomplish, and everybody has ownership of whatever is on this list. And then we keep it pretty simple, right? Like we're just like, these are the things that must happen. And there's always only one owner. And if somebody is helping, that's great, but there's really only one sort of wringable neck for the thing happening or not happening, and accountable to the team, that it gets done within the time that they have estimated it will get done by. So that's sort of the way that our leadership team operates. We call it core team, which is just like basically folks that are engaged in decision making, rather than just working on stuff. And a lot of the core team people are also working on stuff, but like that's just a different function. And so that's kind of how we've managed that. And by the way, my co-founder has helped in so many capacities beyond his meaning like he may not be sort of full time, but he's helped us with like, invoicing and like all kinds of stuff like he's much stronger. Yeah. So it's kind of like, the best way to describe it is that we, especially in the co-founder group, the way we've approached it is who is the best person to solve the problem that needs to be solved. And it doesn't matter if it's the thing that we want to do, right? So it's like, if I really like writing, but I'm not as good a writer as my co-founder, and writing is what we really need somebody to jump on, he's going to jump on it, right? Or if I'm like technically supposed to be processing like legal conversations, but he has a specific reason why he should be in this one legal call without me, then he can go and tackle it. So I think that's a good way of kind of explaining the division of responsibility at this stage.
How do you guys resolve disagreements?
Yeah, I think that so far the best way that we've resolved disagreements is to really kind of point to that functional ownership, right? So we sit down and we talk about kind of like the reasons why we feel strongly about a given decision. But in the end, it's if somebody's the functional owner, they are the functional owner. They're either the functional owner and they make the decision and we trust that they're the functional owner, or if we don't think they should be the functional owner for that area, then we should have that conversation separately, right? So that's and it's been, I don't know, like it's a really good question that you ask, which I think is, it's surprising that we haven't had a ton of disagreements and stuff. We've definitely had situations. I think that my favorite situation is when people tell me, no, we can't do this thing that you want to do, because I think that's healthy, right? Like that folks feel good that they can tell me that that we should definitely not do this thing that I just concocted up because they think it's just not worth the time, or it shouldn't be the priority thing we do. And again, hopefully I've done a decent enough job of stepping in. I call it retreating into the hedges, to use a Homer Simpson analogy, because like it's kind of the read on, all right, well, I really think that, I don't know, lighting on this scene should get another pass, but everybody else seems to think we should move on, and maybe this is not the hill I'm dying on. So that's sort of the way that we solve those. And I think that there's, as I'm sure you've experienced, when the team is really small and there's a pretty trusted relationship between people, there's not a ton of ego in the room when it comes to why we have time only for 3 out of these 10 things we all think should all happen. And so that's been really great to witness. We actually did have early on enough some personnel stuff that came up and that we had to deal with without a head of people or whatever. Right? So you don't have a head of people, you don't have a head of finance. You just have to kind of deal with it and figure it out, and hopefully not mess it up too bad. But again, like and it came down to, we had some conflict that we weren't handling properly, and it was causing a bunch of people to not communicate and not get to a solution that everybody was happy with. And so we sort of like jumped in the middle of that and tried to make changes in the way we communicated that would allow us to sort out that conflict. And at one point it one of the, I guess, weird advantages you have when you're a bootstrap startup is that people are usually not in it for the money. So if something isn't working out, they're not going to be like, I really want to stick it out, like, so it's kind of like, it's a sort of that cuts both ways. But the outcome of it is that you get better team chemistry if you address those issues quickly and early on.
Yeah, I think that's, especially in small team environments, I think that's the most critical piece, is showing that you are working on things and are responsive to it. Makes a world of difference, because otherwise people will be, exactly to your point, they're not going to stick around because they're not incentivized to stick around. Let's talk about fundraising a little bit. You mentioned that you and your original co-founder put some very small amount of money into the business originally, and then you sort of gone from there. But what's the biggest difference for you of how you thought fundraising would go versus how it's played out over until now?
Yeah, so I definitely thought, I guess I overestimated my ability to fundraise, is the best way to put it. I thought I was going to be able to close what I thought at the time was a pretty meager seed, which was $10 million, which turns out was quite a big ask, actually. And I kind of hit the market at the exact wrong moment with the exact wrong ask. But luckily we had built something that was like good enough that a lot of our friends and family and angel round were like very happy to invest. And so it gave us enough of a cushion to be able to adjust our fundraising tactics to then be able to be sort of like right sized to the market. The market just kept moving in the wrong direction as we were right sizing, so it felt like we were like chasing away without ever catching it. And we had some like pretty heartbreaking moments where we thought we had locked down like, millions of dollars, and we got it almost to the finish line, to the point where like we were spending money on lawyers, which I realize now that's probably my second tip of the day. Is like, don't actually spend any money on your seed round closing until all the money is like committed to come to close. Just delay all of that until like you're full on, or at least 10%, 20% oversubscribed. And so we kind of, because it was our first time, we took a contingent term sheet. Then we tried to fill it out. We got like 50% of the way there. So it's like 75% of our fundraise was technically there. But because it was contingent, we got none of it. So it kind of felt like this really long, drawn out thing that was going to happen that didn't happen. Luckily, we were never putting all our eggs in that basket. So we had continued to fundraise from angels in the meantime. So we're able to like raise enough to keep the company functional, and to keep us building towards what we really want to do, is make a first game, make a name for the company in whichever way possible. Right. And so we had to pivot pretty strongly to, all right, we're going to continue to sort of court the fundraising scene in ways, if it makes sense, if we have a thing that we think is going to be good for them. But at the same time, we're also going to go the traditional route of getting something that is in the right shape and developed enough that we can bring into publishers. And we're going to have a plan C where like we can self-publish a reduced version ourselves, just so we can like raise capital based on that. And so we kept proceeding with these kind of like plan A, plan B, plan C scenarios, and continuing to play them out. And that's, I guess, what was unexpected, but like you always prepare for the worst, I guess, is the way I approached it. I learned a lot about sort of the lingo of fundraising and of the different fundraising channels. So I can understand, a slow no better than I used to. I can respect a fast no better than I used to. I can see whether or not what I'm pitching is something that the market even wants. And I can also sort of, there's a lot of paths forward when it comes to building what you want to build that are not exactly what you wanted to do when you started, right? So a lot of pivots along the way for sure. And they never feel like a pivot. So I think that's probably the thing that, when you're hearing about it, reading about it, it never feels like a pivot. When you do it internally, it just feels like, oh no, we're just adapting, right? Like we're just like, all right, this thing is not working. Let's do something else. Or we're still trying to do the same thing, right? Like in your mind, you're still trying to do the same thing, but you've just changed that thing drastically, actually. It's just that like you can see in the destination, and the destination may be the same, right? So it just may be like now it's like 5 years further, or now it's like there's like 3 steps in between, or whatever, right? Because I guess that's either the privilege or the curse of like understanding where you really want to get. But again, it mirrors very much my career in games, right? Like it started in the place I could get someone to give me a shot, and it, ended with what I wanted to do, which is start a studio. And like now, I guess we will see whether or not that was really what I wanted.
Yep. So you've mentioned, going out and courting VC and having a contingent term sheet, and then also lending, friends and families and angels, as well as the money you put in initially. For clarity, in whatever detail you're comfortable sharing, how are you funded today?
Yeah, I think we raised just shy of $1 million total, and we have probably, like, I want to say 3 to 3.5 million of money interest on the sidelines, so to speak, that's ready to deploy, but we still need a lead. We have a couple of leads that we're talking to, but at this point we may not go with any of them, because if we get project funding, I'll just wait till after that happens. And so there's a couple of angels that we're talking to get us enough runway that the project funding won't feel super uncomfortable. But essentially, the way we went about it has been dictated by both the availability of capital and people's willingness to believe where we want to get to, and frankly, like the kind of capital sources that have been more or less responsive to what we want, right? Because I think that the other side of it is sometimes, I think this is probably the lesson that I'm still working on learning, so to speak, which is, you could get a lot less money for a much lower valuation if you just were more in tune with what the market is willing to shell out for what you're pitching, right? I think a lot of people may have this big figure in their head. It's like, hey, with this much money, I can do this thing. But maybe you can do a piece of that thing for a third of the money, right? And a third of the money may feel like a third to you, but may actually bring your chances of securing it up 20x, right? So that's the thing that I think I'm struggling with, because like I get, again, like the kind of like, I'm still in this kind of position where we're still what I would say pre-seed, I guess, when it comes to funding. I've learned to operate in this capacity. And so now to move to a seed, it feels like I only want to do that if what I'm giving up portion of the company wise is worth what I'm getting from both a capital perspective, but also a kind of partnership perspective, right? And now, specifically for how we're going about it, the strategics and publishers just look a lot better than venture. And I think we also are a better bet for them than for venture. Like what we're trying to build, I think, is a little too traditional for venture, or for venture principals to be able to justify venture returns to their MDs. So that's sort of, and then like I had to learn all that too, sort of like the structure and dynamics of how venture operates and how strategics operate and how publishers operate. Because I knew publishers and how they operated, but I didn't know how all publishers operated and all strategics operated, and how this specific year has impacted everything, right? Like you have people that used to cut like $15 million checks now looking to cut $2-3 million checks. Right? That's a massive contraction that I don't think a lot of developers are thinking about. Some developers are, some they're really in tune with, but to us, like I'd say that and this is something that I don't know how many people would discuss that, but I think I was impressed by this lady who was running a studio a year ago. Well, 6 months ago, I met her at DICE, and she told me, "Oh, we used to have a $9 million pitch for a vertical slice, and we changed it into a $900,000 pitch to ship the game." And I was like, "That's so wild! I can't believe you did that. That's so I admire it, but like it sounds crazy." And then like I realized later, I'm like, oh no, like if I look at the journey of what I wanted to initially build to now, what I'm looking to build it for, I've also scaled my ambitions down maybe by like 90% cost wise for total project fund, which I think is like a lot, right? But I think that that's what the market is commanding these days, right? And there's still, you can still get, if you're second dinner, you can still raise $100 million. If you're Benzies, you can still raise $100 million, right? But I think that there's those stories are few and far between, and they're very much like they don't feel like particularly risk taking moves from the VC crowd, right? Like venture is meant to be a funding vehicle that goes after risk and gets outsized reward in exchange for risk. And when I see them investing like growth or like, I don't know, a bank, like it just feels like that we can still get a headline of venture is coming back, but it's not really, right? It's not really venture. It's just investors, investing in something that's pretty low risk, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think second dinner is definitely very much a growth investment, which is just a very different thing, right? Like it's post revenue. It's how do you maximize it? So just for clarity, so that I best understand it before we jump into the next set of questions. Basically, in a pre-seed moment, you had, put in your own funds. You also got sort of angels and about, it sounds like about $1 million in, and you're going to go, and that was to build a vertical slice in order to go and get project funding. And you have some additional potential angel funds and investment that you may use to subsidize that project funding. But have you landed the project funding, or is that still sort of the next big fundraising moment?
No, that's what we're currently doing that.
Yeah.
So we're talking to project funding.
Got it.
Yeah, we had a lot of interest based on what we built. But the next step is sort of like giving them what I call unchaperoned playable, so they can play it, and then that's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, for the project funding conversations, right?
Absolutely.
We either have built something that they think is fun and has a market or not. I happen to think we have, but of course, at this point, I'm the most biased.
Yeah.
But again, like I also wanted to do this for like about I thought it would take 5 to 6 times the money to make what we made. So I'm happy with the fact that we're able to do it for less. I think that it was very difficult on the team, and it was very difficult on our funds and all that to do that. But I think that in the end, when we succeed, that'll yield a reward for our early investors. So that's kind of where we stand.
So, I mean, all that sounds really awesome, and good luck. Knock on wood for you for your current journey through the land of publishers and strategics. All of that can be, just as you sort of alluded to, like adjusting those expectations can be very high stress, a lot of pressure on the team, a lot of pressure on you as you're leading that team. And so sort of the next batch of stuff I want to ask about is like, what are your primary support structures for yourself as a founder? Like, as you go on this journey, how are you supporting yourself and making sure that you don't burn out or go insane? What do you do to make sure that you're in a good space?
Well, so I have a wonderful family and a wonderful wife, and they're super supportive. So that's sort of the bedrock of my mental sanity. I do speak to my founding team a lot. They're also very supportive. I have a couple of Discord groups that I'm a part of. One of whom you've invited me to, which are what they really do is they kind of provide me perspectives of other founders. I also speak to a lot of other studio heads in various stages of their journey, like people who've sold studios for like tens of millions of dollars, people who've like just started even and are now earlier than I was, and it's great to kind of get the perspective. I guess I'm a little lucky being an extrovert that I will just go out and talk to people just to catch up with them, and that gives me a lot of perspective on where I'm at and where everything's at. But yeah, I mean, like it's definitely. I used to think I've been using this line a lot. I used to think I was a stress junkie, and I just didn't know where my ceiling was because everything I'd done before this was just not that as stressful. This is stressful. But luckily, I don't know. Like I'm almost happy that it's been like such a hard start because I think that I know other founders that have had a harder problem. I think, which is you get that start and you get the money and you get to fulfill a piece of your dream, and then the floor collapses from under you and you can't like proceed because your fiscal responsibility was just not where it needed to be, and you didn't even know that you had to be more fiscally responsible because at the time when you were able to sort of secure massive funding was not a time where people were, looking that carefully about sort of should we really be spending this amount of money hiring a concept artist out of like Santa Monica versus the Ukraine, right? And so I don't know, like there's definitely advantages and disadvantages to it.
What's the biggest gap of support that you wish what's the biggest gap you feel, right? Like where you're like, I wish I had more support in this aspect of my founding journey, but I just don't, and I'm sort of toughing it out.
That's a really good question. I almost feel like I've gotten more support than I deserve, but because I feel like people have been, especially in our industry, people are pretty open to talking about stuff like this. So that's sort of the silver lining for it. I think that and this is more my fault. Like I'm an optimist at heart. So I think that if I were to go back and advise myself before doing it, I'd be like, just make sure you have 3 times the money banked. Just bigger cushion, less stress, I suppose. But I don't know. Maybe it's actually good that I have this much sort of this bright of a fire under my ass to move me to make decisions quickly and not poorly, hopefully. I'd say the other side that would be really nice would be, I don't know, like there's not a ton of folks being truly interested in like learning about your thing while they're building their own thing. And I think this is normal, right? But I think that because I actually think that you have to care about your thing the most in order to make it happen. The problem is that in those support groups, I feel like and I think this is my fault as well. like it doesn't feel like a lot of folks will step outside of their day to day to truly say, all right, this is the way I can help you and let me do that. Some people do though. So it's like, so again, like don't really have a lot of complaints there. It's just more like, I think that it just always feels like you could have a massive gap in knowledge that will reveal itself later. And I think that maybe the fact that I've gone through a lot of different sides of our business in my career makes me less susceptible to feeling that way. But I would have to assume that somebody that's starting off will not see a lot of the landmines that are there that you may run into. So I think that, I guess, to end it on a positive, it's up to us to kind of like be proactive in sharing that with people that we see starting their journey, right? Be like, hey, listen, like it can be a lonely road, right? Like, let's talk. Like, don't be afraid. You were actually very open about that, so I really appreciated that. I think other folks that told me about how, and I don't know why. Maybe maybe it's the way I talk about it, but I always feel like I actually have a pretty strong support network in my co-founders, and a lot of people, like, I think always assume like, oh, if you're going to a solo founder journey, it's going to be really lonely. So, like connect with me and make sure that you keep in touch. And I never felt like I was going on a solo founder journey. Like I always felt like I had a team from like day one. But I guess that's an important thing to highlight, right? Not everybody feels that way, right? Like some folks feel like they are on that journey alone because they don't want to have their team tank their stress for them or whatever, right? Like you're trying to insulate the team as much as reasonable from the stresses of fundraising while also keeping them informed so you can be a properly transparent partner, right? So it's a hard line to walk, I suppose, in some days.
So this is going to be I don't know if it's an awkward question. So normally I ask like, oh, what are you looking about on the horizon for yourself and the company? But I feel like we've covered a bunch of that with talking to publishers and strategics and sort of how that will play out. And it's clear you're thinking a lot about that stuff. So I'm going to jump to the last question before we do sort of an introspection lightning round, which is, given the experience thus far, would you ever found another company? Which it feels like, in your case especially, it feels wildly early to ask you that question, but I am curious, like,
I think one of the things that I'll say is probably like the other thing that I would say to new founders is I always built this company because I wanted this to be the last company I ever worked for, right? But I now see that can totally be done more than once. I also think that I think it's really hard to build something with a lot of staying power if you're just thinking about the next thing, right? I think that there's kind of you have to be in it making the thing that'll the end all be all, I think, in order to do the thing that I'm trying to do. Maybe I'm just foolish because but I'm basically all in on this thing. But at the same time, I think that the journey of building things makes you very much. It almost creates this. It takes a little bit of the soul out of just taking a job, right? And I think that that's a door that you walk through that you can't walk back from. It's similar to how, again, I go back to, because I'm a parent, to say, once you have kids, I call them forced wisdom, because you will become wiser. You may not become a better person, like there's plenty of bad parents, but you will be a little wiser from having kids. And I think that the same thing is with a company. You start a company and you see how a lot of this stuff works, and all of a sudden, like just going for a gig, not something you can't do. It's just I don't think it'll ever quite scratch the itch as much as this. I don't know. Like it just feels like it'll always feel a little bit like a little bit of a compromise. But maybe I'm just thinking about it the wrong way, because I know plenty of people that have fantastically rewarding careers working at large conglomerates.
Yeah, I think the question really, for me, it was something that I sort of had to grapple with, I guess, after my first company folded and then coming up to my second one. And I think I've talked to a lot of founders where, it was coming together with such a magic conglomeration of a bunch of choices and things coming together that they, they can't ever imagine repeating that, right? And I've talked to other folks who are like, oh, after that experience, I would never want to do it again, right? Like super rewarding, super loved the experience, super did it, and I would never ever willfully go on that journey again, right? And to your point, I think there are definitely parents out there who are stopped at one because they're like, oh yeah, amazing, great, love my child, never doing that again, right? And so it's always interesting to me to ask, to understand where people are at different parts of the journey, whether they're like, oh yeah, this has been so great, I could totally see doing this again, or they're like, no, never again. Don't ever
I'll
show me
say,
another learning
ask
goal.
me in a year,
There
and
you
then
go.
ask me in 2 years, and then I'll tell you a more educated answer, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So the last part of our conversation, we're going to do, I'm going to ask you a few questions that are sort of an introspection lightning round that are based on the questions I asked potential co-founders when I would first meet them and we'd be doing co-founder dating, right? Like first gut check. And it all kind of comes from this idea of like, you want to understand your co-founders deeply, and a lot of your own strengths and weaknesses and the strengths and weaknesses of your co-founders ultimately become the strengths and weaknesses of your organization. And so the one that I always like to start with is, what do you consider your superpower in the business game making sense?
I think that probably, and it's kind of a double-edged sword, I guess superpowers always are. It's kind of like being unrelenting, meaning just like I will not, like once I am focused on something, I will not stop until I either succeed at it or it destroys me. But that's what I would laser in on. I think that other people would probably point to connectedness, like being able to kind of, if you need to be in a room with someone, I could probably make that happen. Like that's sort of a thing that I just have that I've accumulated through my years of experience. Like, if you need to talk to this one person, there's a path. I can see the exact path of making that happen. Maybe a very hard one, right? but I can make that, architect that for you. And that's, I think, really important when you're trying to determine whether or not this idea or prototype or thing that you're building actually has a chance, right? And so I think that's I would say that's my superpower there.
Outside of your superpower, what are your biggest strengths?
I'd say I'm pretty big in essentially gathering people together and getting them to believe that the direction we're going in is one worth pursuing. I think that's been very. I actually thought that was one of my biggest weaknesses in the past. I think that I've actually building this company has taught me that it's more of a strength than a weakness. Is I used to think that I had a really hard time actually, like, sort of learning enough about people to understand how to align their interests with the interests of the objective. But I just didn't have an objective that I cared about enough. Once I really care about it, like, that becomes very easy. So that's one of my strengths. I think the other is that I think as much as possible, I try to lead by example. Meaning, like, if I expect someone to try to perform, I will be right there with them in the trenches performing, right? And if I'm gonna ask folks to, like, work, I don't know, at 75% of what their compensation should be, I will compensate myself like 70% of what my compensation should be, right? And so, like, I think that's something that to me, it's not even a question. It's just like morally, like, what you should be doing. But I think it's actually not always seen in our industry specifically. So I think I line it up under strengths. I also think I'm a pretty decent on planning. I'm actually, like, if anybody you knew talked about me, they'd probably be like, he's a little bit kind of all over the place, but things do tend to happen on time and on budget when I'm running them. And that's because, like, on the line items that matter, I actually take a ton of time planning them and, like, making sure that we have, like, contingencies in place and all that in order to kind of deliver. So I don't know. That's what I'd say my biggest strengths are there. And I think other people would, and this is something that's really kind of hard to call a strength, because it's like, feels like you're patting yourself on the back. But I guess I'm a pretty positive person. And, I'd say like 75% of people appreciate that. 25% of people hate me for it, but I try to be really kind to those people.
What are your big weaknesses?
I think that the double edge of all these things that I just talked about is probably like an easy way to look at it. I think I can be sort of the only reason that I haven't changed my video game call sign to Guy Scope Creep Costantini is because like if you called yourself Scope Creep, I don't think that would go really well with like people that don't understand project management. They'd probably just be like somebody's calling themselves a creep. But I do have a tendency to get really excited about things and want to put all the good stuff in things, and I know that can be the death of quality. So I've over time learned to sort of try to compensate for that weakness, but it's definitely a weakness of mine. And like I have a lot of systems in place to account for that. And I make it a point that all the people that work with me know that they can, use trigger words to shut me up, and all that. I also think that, because I'm an optimist, I have a tendency to kind of like, try to shoot beyond what is possible. And then like, of course, get my heart broken many times when the reality sets in. And like I do wear my emotions on my sleeve sometimes, so like people will see it and see that I'm kind of let down by stuff. And as you further along into leadership, it's not always a good thing to express, even if you're kind about it, to show how this thing that somebody spent a week building is like not exactly where you want it to be. Sometimes there's a better way to convey that message, and I think it's something that I've had to learn over time. I feel like I'm a terrible, terrible teacher. Like and this is like, I'm on a path of trying to be just average at this with my kids, because it's important for your kids for you to not suck at teaching. But I'm just horribly impatient when it comes to teaching things that I already know, to other people. So it's just literally horrible. And it's doubly horrible because my mom's a teacher and I respect the profession incredibly. That muscle is atrophied in me. And so I usually just try to hire people that are better than me at that. Part of the optimism can be also another weakness when it comes to staffing and attracting talent. So I always need to make sure that I have somebody on my team that's like, much more critical than I am for the talent that we attract. Because I may say like, look at all this great stuff they've done. And then my counterpart would be like, yes, but they're terrible to work with. So like, it doesn't matter that they're really talented because we will make nothing good with them. Right. So that's another one of my weaknesses, I suppose.
What are your stress reactions?
I want to ask you a question there because I don't understand what you mean by stress. What do I do when I'm under stress?
Yes. Like what are your, how do your behavior patterns change? Like what do you become when you're specifically under a stressful moment?
So that's actually something I didn't bring up as a strength, but I think it's one of my strengths is that, just because of my upbringing, like I usually do pretty well under pressure. Like one of the things that I never, it's almost like I like stressful situations because then what is necessary becomes clear, right? Like, so that's sort of like my favorite thing. So I guess my stress reaction would be identify the things that are the causes of the problem and be able to laser focus on removing them. And I guess the flip side of that is that absent stress, I'm not great at it, right? Like, so I think that stress makes me better at kind of like really focusing. Yeah, I think that I think if I had to point out to another stress reaction, one that's not as positive, is I think I have a tendency to ask for updates more frequently than I would want to be asked myself, when I'm under stress. And I have to look at my calendar and be like, no, you should really not check with this person because like they need time to do the work. So like maybe shut up. So that's another one that's sort of like, if I had to call it out.
And the final question, which I'll add clarity to, is what are your upkeep needs? Which is basically what are things that you sort of need on a regular basis in order to stay in a good headspace, to stay stable, kind of thing. So an example for me is if I don't get feedback on my work, like if I do a project or I do a spreadsheet or a document or whatever, and I don't get someone to say, hey, I looked at that was useful, or hey, I looked at that and here's feedback. If it just sort of goes into the void and I hear crickets, I start to go literally insane. And so that's one of my upkeep needs. And so I'm curious, do you have anything that you sort of see yourself as having an upkeep need?
I guess that I really like some of these questions because they're making me think of things that I don't usually think about. I guess I need to feel that there's progress, right, on things. And usually the way that I identify progress is we are tangibly in a better spot than we used to be in. And we've made something, we've built something concrete that is demonstrably a consequence of our work, or where we are with this phase of our business is beyond where we used to be in by a factor that seems impressive. I think there's a need for me to feel like the work that we're doing is something that will make someone happy one day. And that's sort of like the way that I analyze everything we do. I'll look at it, I'll be like, all right, is this going to make the team proud of what they did one day? Is this going to make players happy one day? Right? Like, it's just like, I always need to look at it. And actually, this is one of the things that I like the most about the founder experience is that it's made me way less tolerant about stuff that I think is useless. And not because I'm like angry at the people doing it. I'm just like, there's just only a certain amount of time that we have to do things. And so, and I used to be like in the opposite side of it where I'm like, yeah, I'll take a couple of meetings at Gamescom for fun to just catch up with people. And now I'm just like, why is this time slot in a meeting that has 20% utility? So I'm just like, I don't know, maybe I've become too anal on it. But I think that it's taught me a lot about the scarcity of time. And I think that's an important lesson to take out of it.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Guy, and answering all these questions I have for you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Do you have anything you want to sort of shout out or call out or chill while you're here?
Well, we are an unannounced studio making an unannounced game. I'm Guy Costantini. Connect to me whenever you want. You may find out what we're doing at some point when we have something worth showing. And then we will tell you all about it. But thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks again for joining us.
All right, man. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it, and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano, music by Jake Hull, who's available for composer work in games. And if you're interested in learning more about the Game Founder support community, go to gamefounders.org or email me at carl@gamefounders.org. Thanks so much.